The Diary of Anne Frank by Frances Goodrich and Albert Hackett. Act 1, Scene 3. It is a little after 6 o'clock in the evening, 2 months later. Margot is in the bedroom at the right, studying. Mr. Van Daan is lying down in the attic room above. The rest of the family is in the main room. Anne and Peter sit opposite each other at the center table, where they have been doing their lessons. Mrs. Frank is on the couch. Mrs. Van Daan is seated with her fur coat, on which she has been sewing, in her lap. None of them are wearing their shoes. Their eyes are on Mr. Frank, waiting for him to give them the signal which will release them from their day-long quiet. Mr. Frank, his shoes in his hand, stands looking down out of the window at the back, watching to be sure that all of the workmen have left the building below. After a few seconds of motionless silence, Mr. Frank turns from the window. Mr. Frank, quietly to the group. It is safe now. The last workman has left. There is an immediate stir of relief. Anne, her pent-up energy explodes. Whee! Mr. Frank, startled, amused. Anne? Mrs. Van Daan, I'm first for the WC. She hurries off to the bathroom. Mrs. Frank puts on her shoes and starts up to the sink to prepare supper. Anne sneaks Peter's shoes from under the table and hides them behind her back. Mr. Frank goes into Margot's room. Mr. Frank to Margot. 6 o'clock, school's over. Margot gets up, stretching. Mr. Frank sits down to put on his shoes. In the main room, Peter tries to find his. Peter to Anne. Have you seen my shoes? Anne, innocently. Your shoes? Peter. You've taken them, haven't you? Anne. I don't know what you're talking about. Peter. You're going to be sorry. Anne. Am I? Peter goes after her. Anne, with his shoes in her hand, runs from him, dodging behind her mother. Mrs. Frank, protesting. Anne, dear. Peter. Wait till I get you. Peter. Anne. I'm waiting. Peter makes a lunge for her. They both fall to the floor. Peter pins her down, wrestling with her to get the shoes. Don't, Peter, stop it, ouch. Mrs. Frank. Anne, Peter. Suddenly, Peter becomes self-conscious. He grabs his shoes roughly and starts for his room. Anne, following him. Peter, where are you going? Come dance with me. Peter. I tell you I don't know how. Anne, I'll teach you. Peter. I'm going to give Mushi his dinner. Anne. Can I watch? Peter. He doesn't like people around while he eats. Anne. Peter, please. Peter. No. He goes to his room. Anne slams his door after him. Mrs. Frank. Anne, dear, I think you shouldn't play like that with Peter. It's not dignified. Anne. Who cares if it's dignified? I don't want to be dignified. Mr. Frank and Margot come from the room on the right. Margot goes to help her mother. Mr. Frank starts for the center table to correct Margot's school papers. Mrs. Frank to Anne. You complain that I don't treat you like a grown-up, but when I do, you resent it. Anne. I only want some fun, someone to laugh and clown with. After you sat still all day and hardly moved, you've got to have some fun. I don't know what's the matter with that boy. Mr. Frank. He isn't used to girls. Give him a little time. Anne. Time? Isn't 2 months time? I could cry. Catching hold of Margot. Come on, Margot. Come dance with me. Come on, please. Margot. I have to help with supper. Anne. You know, we're going to forget how to dance. When we get out, we won't remember a thing. She starts to sing and dance by herself. Mr. Frank takes her in his arms, waltzing with her. Mrs. Van Daan comes in from the bathroom. Mrs. Van Daan. Next, she looks around as she starts putting on her shoes. Where's Peter? Anne, as they are dancing. Where would he be? Mrs. Van Daan. He hasn't finished his lessons, has he? His father'll kill him if he catches him in there with that cat and his work not done. Mr. Frank and Anne finish their dance. They bow to each other with extravagant formality. Anne, get him out of there, will you? Anne, at Peter's door. Peter, 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 opening the door a crack. What is it? Anne, your mother says to come out. Peter, I'm giving Mooshie his dinner. Mrs. Van Dam, you know what your father says. She sits on the couch, sewing on the lining of her fur coat. Peter, for heaven's sake, I haven't even looked at him since lunch. Mrs. Van Dam, I'm just telling you, that's all. Anne, I'll feed him. Peter, I don't want you in there. Mrs. Van Dam, Peter! Peter, to Anne, then give him his dinner and come right out, you hear? He comes back to the table. Anne shuts the door of Peter's room after her and disappears behind the curtain covering his closet. Mrs. Van Dam, to Peter, now is that any way to talk to your little girlfriend? Peter, Mother, for heaven's sakes, will you please stop saying that? Mrs. Van Dam, look at him blush, look at him. Peter, please, I'm not. Anyway, let me alone, will you? Mrs. Van Dam, he acts like it was something to be ashamed of. It's nothing to be ashamed of to have a little girlfriend. Peter, you're crazy. She's only 13. Mrs. Van Dam, so what? And you're 16. Just perfect. Your father's 10 years older than I am. To Mr. Frank, I warn you, Mr. Frank, if this war lasts much longer, we're going to be related. And then, Mr. Frank, Mazel tov. Mrs. Frank, deliberately changing the conversation. I wonder where Meep is. She's usually so prompt. Suddenly everything else is forgotten as they hear the sound of an automobile coming to a screeching stop in the street below. They are tense, motionless in their terror. The car starts away. A wave of relief sweeps over them. They pick up their occupations again. Anne flings open the door of Peter's room, making a dramatic entrance. She is dressed in Peter's clothes. Peter looks at her in fury. The others are amused. Anne, good evening, everyone. Forgive me if I don't stay. She jumps up on a chair. I have a friend waiting for me in there, my friend Tom Cat. Some people say that we look alike, but Tom has the most beautiful whiskers, and I have only a little fuzz. I am hoping, in time... Peter, all right, Mrs. Quack Quack. Anne, outraged, jumping down. Peter! Peter, I heard about you. How you talked so much in class they called you Mrs. Quack Quack. How Mr. Smitter made you write a composition. Quack, quack, said Mrs. Quack, quack. Anne, well, go on. Tell them the rest. How it was so good he read it out loud to the class and then read it to all his other classes. Peter, quack, 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 quack. Anne pulls off the coat and trousers. Anne, you are the most intolerable, insufferable boy I've ever met. She throws the clothes down the stairwell. Peter goes down after them. Peter, quack, quack, quack. Mrs. Van Dam, to Anne. That's right, Annika. Give it to him. Anne, with all the boys in the world, why I had to get locked up with one like you. Peter, quack, quack, quack. And from now on, stay out of my room. As Peter passes her, Anne puts out her foot, tripping him. He picks himself up and goes on to his room. Mrs. Frank, quietly. Anne, dear, your hair. She feels Anne's forehead. You're warm. Are you feeling all right? Anne, please, Mother. She goes over to the center table, slipping into her shoes. Mrs. Frank, following her. You haven't a fever, have you? Anne, pulling away. No, no. Mrs. Frank, you know we can't call a doctor here, ever. There's only one thing to do. Watch carefully. Prevent an illness before it comes. Let me see your tongue. Anne, Mother, this is perfectly absurd. Mrs. Frank, Anne, dear, don't be such a baby. Let me see your tongue. As Anne refuses, Mrs. Frank appeals to Mr. Frank. Otto? Mr. Frank, you hear your mother, Anne. Anne flicks out her tongue for a second, then turns away. Mrs. Frank, come on, open up. As Anne opens her mouth very wide, you seem all right, but perhaps an aspirin. Mrs. Van Dam, for heaven's sake, don't give that child any pills. I waited for 15 minutes this morning for her to come out of the WC. Anne, I was washing my hair. Mr. Frank, I think there's nothing the matter with our Anne that a ride on her bike or a visit with her friend Joppy de Wall wouldn't cure. Isn't that so, Anne? Mr. Van Daan comes down into the room. From outside we hear faint sounds of bombers going over and a burst of ack, ack, ack. Mr. Van Daan, meat not come yet? Mrs. Van Daan, the workman just left a little while ago. Mr. Van Daan, what's for dinner tonight? Mrs. Van Daan, beans. Mr. Van Daan, not again. Mrs. Van Daan, poor Pooty, I know. But what can we do? That's all meat brought us. Mr. Van Daan starts a pace, his hands behind his back. Anne follows behind him, imitating him. Anne, we are now in what is known as the bean cycle. Beans boiled, beans in casserole, beans with strings, beans without strings. Peter has come out of his room. He slides into his place at the table, becoming immediately absorbed in his studies. Mr. Van Daan, to Peter, I saw you in there playing with your cat. Mrs. Van Daan, he just went in for a second, putting his coat away. He's been out here all the time doing his lessons. Mr. Frank, looking up from the paper. Anne, you got an excellent in your history paper today, and very good in Latin. Anne, sitting beside him. How about algebra? Mr. Frank, I'll have to make a confession. Up until now I've managed to stay ahead of you in algebra. Today you caught up with me. We'll leave it to Margot to correct. Anne, isn't algebra vile, Pim? Mr. Frank, vile. Margot to Mr. Frank, how did I do? Anne, getting up. Excellent, 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 excellent. Mr. Frank to Margot, you should have used the subjunctive here. Margot, should I? I thought, look here. I didn't use it here. The two become absorbed in the papers.